Hi everybody, this is part 1 of the lecture to accompany chapter 4 in your textbook. Please read chapter 4. There's a lot of information I don't have time to address in this lecture. Okay, let's talk about credibility. The two stories at the beginning of chapter 4 point out the tendency we have to put our trust in things and people that turn out to be untrustworthy. In the first example, a man who's looking for love meets a woman who appears to return his affection, but his belief in her credibility is misplaced, and tragically he ends up dead. The second example is a more common scenario in which a man receives an email from his bank telling him his account needs to be updated and warning that access might be suspended if he doesn't act quickly. It looks legitimate, but is actually fraudulent. Because he believes the source of the email is credible, he provides all his account information to them and ends up with fraudulent charges on his account. We might say these people were stupid or gullible, but that's not necessarily the case. They were human, making human errors based not on logic and reasoning, but on emotion, like the need for love in the first instance, and fear and anxiety about their finances in the second instance. And more importantly, their incorrect perception that the other person or institution had their best interests in mind and was providing them with good information. The philosopher Aristotle pointed out that ethos, or the credibility of the speaker, the source of the information, is one of the ways we are persuaded. Because we must judge the credibility of information sources daily, it's important that we understand how critical thinking can help us make better choices about who we can trust. There are basically two things we need to do to assess credibility. We look at the claims being made to try to determine their accuracy, and we look at the source of the information to try to determine whether that source has any business at all providing that information to us. Now, these are not all or nothing kinds of things. There are degrees of credibility and incredibility. Some claims are obviously true, some obviously false. But the truthfulness of other claims are more difficult to determine. Some sources are immediately suspect, others not so much. And you might need to do some background checking to determine their credibility. And guess what? It does kind of fall to you to make those determinations. So let's look at the ways in which we determine the veracity of claims, then look at how we determine whether a source is credible. People make claims based on common knowledge all the time, and you don't need to verify whether or not they're true. But for other claims, you might immediately suspect their veracity because they clash with either your personal observations or your background knowledge. What is personal observation? It's what you perceive with your senses at any given moment. What you see, hear, smell, taste, or touch. Your background information or background knowledge is the immense body of justified beliefs that consist of facts that you've gathered both through personal observation and gained from other sources like teachers, parents, books, the internet, throughout your life. We generally consider our personal observations to be our most reliable source of information about the world. For instance, the text uses the example of a friend who shows you his new red car. Then later another friend tells you the car's blue. You know what you saw. You know the car was red, and you dismiss what the other friend says. So seeing is believing, as they say. And in many cases, it is indeed true that we can generally trust what we perceive to be what is actually the case. However, personal observations can lead us to incorrect conclusions. The textbook mentions how unreliable witness testimony tends to be when it's used as evidence in court cases. The Innocence Project has found a large percentage of unjustly imprisoned people were convicted on the basis of witness testimony, but DNA evidence later proved that the witnesses were incorrect. So how can we be deceived by our own senses? Well, in lots of ways. Tiredness or distraction, worry or other emotional upset can get in the way. Physical illness or debilitation can keep you from perceiving correctly. Environmental influences like bad lighting, noise, or the speed of events, they happen so quickly that you really can't tell exactly what happened. Even our beliefs, our hopes, fears, and expectations get in the way of true perception. And of course, if we have some personal interest or bias involved, that can make a big difference. A claim may also conflict with our background knowledge, which we have spent a lifetime collecting, justifying, and confirming, so we might immediately dismiss new information that doesn't fit in with it. We assign a level of initial plausibility to claims, which is a rough estimate of how credible that claim seems to be. We immediately think, well, this is probably not true, or that sounds like it might be the case, or that is very likely true, based on our worldview. Here's an example. Which of these is the most unbelievable claim? The teacher owns a rabbit, the teacher owns a dump truck, or the teacher owns a hippopotamus. So which one sounds the least plausible or the most plausible? The most plausible one is that I own a rabbit because, while that's not the most common pet to have, lots of people do own them. And yes, I actually have one. The one that might be plausible, but you might have your doubts about, is the dump truck. I suppose if my husband was a truck driver or owned a construction company or something like that, we might own a dump truck. But the last one, the teacher owns a hippopotamus, seems really unlikely. Questions like, how did she find the hippopotamus? Where does she keep it? And isn't it illegal to keep a hippopotamus? Yes, those kinds of things immediately spring to mind to add to the doubt. The idea that I might own a hippopotamus conflicts with pretty much everyone's background knowledge, so everyone is likely to say that it really doesn't sound plausible. And of course, the more unbelievable the claim, the stronger the evidence you're going to need to accept it. So if I really did own a hippopotamus, even though that's difficult for you to believe, I would have to do more than just say I owned one. I might have to bring you to my house and show you where I keep my hippopotamus or something of that nature before you'd believe me. Background information, while it is helpful in determining validity of claims, is certainly not perfect. Because our perceptions can mislead us, the information we collect over our lifetimes can be lacking, can be incorrect, or can certainly be biased. People may make claims to you, and you might not have enough background information about that specific topic to make a good assessment, so you might either accept it or reject it based simply at face value. As a good critical thinker, though, you should really assign a level of initial plausibility to claims. However, you really have to keep an open mind and realize that further information might cause you to give up a belief that you previously thought was true. And of course, the broader your background information, the more likely you're going to be to evaluate those claims correctly. Now, when I say you should keep an open mind, I don't mean that you should just believe what other people tell you. I like the saying, you should keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. I have an example of how this can go very badly very quickly. I had a student in a public speaking class who wanted to do his persuasive speech on Bigfoot. His thesis was that Bigfoot wasn't real and people who thought so were wasting time and energy looking for it. But in his research, he found a couple of blogs where people who believed in Bigfoot were commenting. And long story short, he changed his mind and his thesis to Bigfoot is real. Needless to say, I was quite surprised when he gave the speech and disappointed that he was so easily swayed to change his mind. He didn't have a lot of background information on the topic initially, so when he did his research, he probably just typed the word Bigfoot into Google and got taken to some pretty shady websites and kind of fell down the rabbit hole into the world of conspiracy theory. This example leads nicely to the next way that we determine credibility, by looking at the source of the claim. Now, in this case, the student probably didn't look at the most credible sources for this topic. So now that we've looked at how we determine the credibility of a claim, let's turn our attention to where the information comes from, the source. While there are sources that you generally trust to provide you with correct information, like your friends, your parents, your significant other, there are other sources about which we might have questions. Aristotle talked about source credibility, or ethos, in that we are more likely to trust people who seem knowledgeable, truthful, objective, and reliable. If we already think that the source doesn't possess those qualities, we may automatically distrust whatever they tell us. There are certain factors that we tend to use to determine a source's credibility, whether the source is an interested or disinterested party, whether there are any telltale clues that we can distinguish about them, and whether the person has adequate expertise on the topic. Let's look at all three of those. The first one is a very important factor: whether or not the source making the claim is considered an interested or disinterested party. An interested party is one who stands to gain from our belief in their claim. Politicians who want your vote, salespeople who might be making a commission off of your purchase, those are examples of interested parties. The book gives other examples of sources who have something to gain by convincing you. So you should automatically be more skeptical of the claims made by interested parties. Not that they are all necessarily out to get you, but you need to make sure what they are telling you is good information. Disinterested parties, on the other hand, are those who have no stake in whether you believe their claim or not. So a salesperson who's paid by the hour and not by how much product they sell doesn't really have anything to gain if you don't buy their product. Now, certainly not all disinterested parties have good information to share, but at least you know they're not giving you information that will be of more benefit to them than it will be to you. While whether a source is interested or disinterested may be relevant to their credibility, humans have a tendency to base their judgments on things that are actually irrelevant to how credible someone is. We think that how a person looks or acts has something to do with how credible their information is, but frankly, these things tend to tell us very little about that person's credibility. This list of clues, like excessive sweating, shifty eye movement, somebody's avoiding eye contact with you, they're staring up to the left, or other kinds of what are called micro-expressions. They have a wimpy handshake, they changed the subject, they appear to lack self-confidence, or they have nervous laughter. These are really not clues to a person's character. Plus, a practiced con artist can appear confident, while a perfectly honest person might have all of the above characteristics. Most of us are only able to detect when a person is lying to us about 50% of the time, so these things really don't help us. But it's not just nervousness or lack of self-confidence that we tend to judge as less credible. We also judge people on the basis of other, frankly, irrelevant characteristics, like these: the clothes they're wearing, their posture, their gender, their age, accent, nationality, or even their height. A person's appearance isn't a helpful determining factor in their credibility, but lots of people use things like racism, sexism, or ageism to determine whether someone is trustworthy. When we fall back on stereotypes as a way to determine who's trustworthy, we're doing it wrong. A person who looks like you isn't automatically more trustworthy than someone who doesn't. So, if we can't tell how credible and knowledgeable a source is just by looking at them, how do we tell? There are some very good indicators. What kind of education does this person have? Of course, formal education counts, but so does the education that comes from years of experience in a particular field. Your car mechanic doesn't need a doctorate in engineering to know what's wrong with your car and how to fix it, but your neurosurgeon better have the necessary credentials and experience before you let him cut into your brain. Doing some research on the source and finding out what their educational background is, how many years of experience they have, that can go a long way to determining whether the information they are giving you is good. Reputation is also important. Is this person held in high consideration among others in his or her field? What positions has this person held in their career? What are their achievements? These things all factor into how much trust you can place in what they say. But just because someone is considered an expert in one field, that doesn't make him or her an expert in another field. So an expert in marine biology isn't necessarily an expert in finance. However, they might be credible to speak to global warming issues, as those issues also affect marine life. When you read the section on expertise, you'll find that it can be more complicated than what I just said, but it's the best way to determine whether or not a source is credible and can speak to a topic. Now, all that having been said, even the most honest and credible sources sometimes make mistakes. They might have unconscious biases, and they might lack enough expertise to provide good information about a topic. When we accept doubtful claims from people who we otherwise trust, or accept claims that seem credible from doubtful sources, we set ourselves up to accept bad information or possibly even be deceived. So always look at both the claim and the source of that claim when you're trying to determine whether or not to accept it. This is the end of part 1. Please move on to part 2.